Please take a seat, gentlemen. We have a nice spread of experience from Europe, from the US, and from the UK. And I liked very much, of course, if you look at my own organization, EIT Digital, by the way, formerly known as EIT, ICT Labs, but you had so many difficulties here to pronounce it that we changed the name to be a little bit more soft and pronounceable, is a European organization. And I very much appreciated Maro, and I told him when he left stage, working together is very important. So indeed, I mean, does the nationality of a startup really matter? I think it's a very profound question, especially when we're talking about a single European market. Isn't there a kind of single European startup pool? And are there really Dutch big national differences as we sometimes think, or should we also break those borders? And that has also very much to do with how universities act in the European landscape. You see that universities are pretty much nation-oriented. And what we will look at now is how do universities now work together with startups. And I would like to just start, because I have three panelists that are very experienced in that domain, to first start and ask them, okay, what is your personal experience in your environment with the collaboration between universities and startups? And I would like to start to give the floor first to Stewart. Stewart?
Thank you. Hey, everyone. Is anybody else in here cold, or is it just me? All right, good. I just thought I was Scottish, and I brought it with me. So I think I'm happy to say that as a university, and the university would find it very funny that I'm speaking on behalf of the university, Cambridge is very open to startups, but I suppose the really important thing is it's really open to entrepreneurial people and entrepreneurial attitudes as kind of people interact rather than organizations. So there's this really porous boundary between the academics and the entrepreneurs in the surrounding community.
Cameron?
Stanford has a very long history of entrepreneurship since like the 1930s. They've been doing, the first Dean of Teitelman, Dean of Engineering, funded Hewlett-Packard as his students and sent them off and gave them space at the research park. So that's also why Silicon Valley is so far ahead, is because they've had generations and generations of entrepreneurs coming out and then supporting each other. As an institution, it's oscillated between being supportive and adversarial to startups. Just to be very honest and candid, they have these amazing policies where professors can take sabbatical or even consult companies that may have a conflict with the university, and they have no issue with that. So they can attract really amazing professors. That being said, they want to encourage people to graduate. And so they encourage entrepreneurial thinking, but don't like it when people drop out. So that causes tensions, and we are an interesting entity in that we are actually legally separate from Stanford, but they fund us, and we're partnered with them, and we fought with them a little at the beginning, and now we're friends, and happy to talk more.
John, your experiences?
Well, Berkeley is equally entrepreneurial. A company like Chiron, some of you may know in the biosciences, was founded by a Berkeley professor. Actually, Sun Microsystems was a joint Berkeley-Stanford operation built really on Berkeley technology. But what I was saying to Willem earlier was that there are really three elements that have contributed to that success, three sort of matchings that have to take place around research, around people's careers, and ultimately social. Around research, one of the links has to be that the kind of research that's going on in the university has to actually meet needs of industry, and the demands of industry have to not divert the bulk of the researchers in university from what they need to do to be able to succeed. We had a program called the Industry University Cooperative Research Program for many years, and the way it was set up is industry put up 50% of the money. The program itself, the program on which I was on the board, put up 50%, and the projects had to be jointly industry, academic proposed, and they were all vetted academically only. So it had to actually be useful to industry, but it had to meet a standard that would mean that the faculty member proposing could get promoted. So that was a way of making those gears actually work. Careers, Ed Penhode, who founded Chiron after he made a good deal of money out of it, came back to be dean. But the social part, I think, is equally important. I mean, many years ago, now it's changed a bit, but people would come asking for money in Silicon Valley in suits. And the people giving them money, or not giving them money, were wearing jeans that in fact were much more expensive than the suits. And there wasn't exactly a fit. And when I started my career, because I started my adult life in Paris and have worked in Europe for many years, I was having trouble with interviews. And I went to someone who'd been given me as a mentor there. And after listening to my woes in French, he then picked up the phone and called his tailor. Now, there was a mismatch between an American who'd spent some money trying to get clothes and what the grammar of clothing and business was in France, since I was interviewing business people. So those three elements actually in any strategy have to be attended to and have to be made to work.
Very good. What I heard in all three of you, that you actually say, I mean, it's also this interaction and being in industry, then being in the university and going back in industry. And I wanted to elaborate a little bit, because a lot of the thinking is, okay, the university is the seed, then you create some technology, then you make it a startup, you go out, and there you go your way. If I look at my own organization, what we see is that we expose startups to research teams and research team to startups, and you see a kind of mutual benefit in both ways. Do you recognize? I see you nodding, so maybe Cameron, you can start from that.
So I think one of the important things Silicon Valley has done well is it's provided examples. And so when you talk about this interaction between research and startups, I think the most important thing it does for the startups, and maybe it's a social thing, is it makes them be like, oh wow, I can actually do that. And then they think, you know, do I want to do fundamental research to push knowledge forward, or do I want to do practical, not that fundamental research is very important, it's not practical, but do I want to do industry-specific practical research to actually solve a current existing problem and maybe spin out a company? So yes, I do see industry interacting with research teams a lot. I don't see that necessarily turning into them building a company together, but it turns into the mindset of that PhD being willing to take that risk.
Very good. Stewart, you may want to add to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So to give you a concrete example, so the part of the university I run is called Idearspace. We didn't pay a branding consultant, so we got stuck with the name. We currently work with just over 93, 95 companies. And of those 95 companies, 20% have come from the university and 50% joined us to work with the university. And 30% have nothing to do with the university other than through us. So the majority of the companies we work with are there to work with the university rather than to come from them.
I think that's an important observation, which I can confirm in actually the way we are working, is that actually if you look to our startup funnel all over our network, that the majority is recruited from outside, where a minority is indeed directly coming from that university, and this two-way interaction is very, very interesting. Of course, I mean, this is also about what is the kind of culture in Europe, what is the kind of culture in the US. And John, you mentioned these three elements that are very, very important. And as you have been in Europe, in several countries, you even speak French fluently, and you have been here in the Valley. Could you say what are, in your view, the most remarkable differences on these three elements in the US and in Europe that may explain part of the difference we see in the ecosystems?
That's a tough question. I do have to say that when we were giving names to things, BRI, the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy, was not an accident. It was a marketing strategy. We sat around with a bottle of wine and tried to figure out what acronym would be memorable, and two of us had started our adult lives in France, so we hit on BRI. But that said, part of the issue, I think, is on the, having lived in a number of European countries, it's evolved over time. But there really is a sense in many in the university that, in fact, they are counterpoint to the rest of society, and they need to in some way keep themselves distinct. I don't see the distinction between basic research and applied research quite as sharply as many others might, since Ed Penholt was a fundamental molecular biologist, and Dave Culler at Berkeley, who some of you may know, in fact has done some very basic and fundamental things. A number of their students often then do the applied work. So you have to have both, and they have to be comfortable in both. But that, I think the issue again becomes social as to what's really comfortable on both sides.
Stewart, would you like to comment on that? Especially this indeed being distinct from society or being part of society? You recognize this?
We like to think we're saving society from our academics, but we shouldn't put that too further. No, absolutely. So I think, so one of the things that we see is when you're, so our vice chancellor, so I'm not sure if that translates to the American system or not, but kind of the guy that's not the top ceremonial person kind of says there's two types of research. There's not applied and there's not applied yet. And it's just we haven't got there yet with a lot of this research, and we'll see where it goes. And I completely agree with the idea that you have the senior academic that does the theoretical work, and then you see the postdocs, or early stage careers, researchers, take it out of the university and apply it.
I want to look at two different elements as well. One is the role of the government, and the other one is the role of the industry in the landscape. So the role of the government, maybe we should start, Cameron. I mean, what is the role of the US government in the startup-university relationship?
Well, I guess it depends on where in the funnel you look. Like if you just look at where startups are created, it's almost zero. I mean, there's some, but what these guys are saying is that a lot of the fundamentals end up bubbling up into that. A lot of the biggest and best companies out of Stanford have come from government research funding, but and then after they build a lot of the fundamentals, it then bubbles up and they're able to create these breakthrough innovations built on a lot of other people's work. And so I would say at the point of inception, you don't see it, but it's absolutely necessary to create that kind of those core innovations and the things that the government ends up sometimes like seeding as research projects that turn into stuff. Specifically on the healthcare side, we see that a lot where there's some biotech need or some sort of healthcare need, and they seed projects that end up spinning out.
John, you also look at policy making around this, so what's your opinion here?
Well, a good deal in the American case, of course, is who owns the intellectual property when a project is finished. And in this case, it's usually the institution that's been doing the work, which allows it to then commercialize it more easily. In the case of Europe, in many cases, government overwhelms and dominates the definition of what the work ought to be and tends to get in the way, in the same way that the American military-industrial complex has actually, in a way, distorted and blocked a lot of innovation. Anybody who wants the Star Wars program in Europe, you're welcome to it.
So just a comment on that. Just to make that more specific, in the US, the institution will actually own the IP. But when a company spins out, the institution actually doesn't own the company. They own a small percentage of it. And that's really, really important. So they'll own 5%. Even though they own the IP, they'll own just a little sliver of it, and then the actual, and maybe some royalties from it, but the actual inventor and the founders who are building it have a real incentive to actually take this huge risk.
I have to say that that's true at Stanford. Berkeley doesn't negotiate as well. So
we even see differences in the US landscape.
So that in fact the institution will license the technology, and the question is on what terms. Stanford is very good at managing that, and it's contributed to it in important ways. And it's an important lesson to learn, how to in fact become a player in the system for whatever institution in fact is disposing of that technology.
Yeah, it had like 5% of Google. I will say though, even though it does a really good job, all the entrepreneurs still complain about it tremendously. So.
Okay, so I mean, we looked at the role of the government. The other one is, of course, the role of the industries in such ecosystems. I get a signal that we are also having to wrap up little by little. So maybe a quick word from the UK. I mean, what's the role of industries in your ecosystem, in your startup creation, and so on? So do they play a role?
So they definitely play a role. I think what John said was really important. So the key thing to getting it right is to have the work be interesting to industry as well as be interesting to the academic. And that goes in terms of topic and ownership. So often, so industry likes to have it always, right? Much like government and academics, we all like to have it our way. So often industry will say, we want a single point of contact. You're like, that's fantastic. Can we have a single point of contact for you? And they go, no, that's not going to work. Or they say, right, we're going to fund this, but we need to own everything. You're like, well, what's the incentive for us to continue this sort of thing? Or we'll fund your research, but you can't talk about it for the next 10 years. And you're just like, those aren't terms that you can do business on. So it's really important.
Do you see a similar situation in the US, or is there a big difference here?
Well, you can't spin out a company if the founders don't have enough stake. Investors won't invest in companies where the founders don't own enough equity. So it's kind of a moot point. I think people have gotten that. I think, yes, sometimes they stifle it, but then people figure out how to do it otherwise. I'm curious, are you a separate entity from Cambridge, or you're part of them?
Depends on the day of the week.
Like legally a separate entity?
Legally, I report to the PVC or research.
Okay, interesting. Are we wrapping up?
Yes, we are wrapping
I have
up,
to, we didn't answer the question, startups and universities, would that ever work? So I'm curious if you guys think that startups should be built out
So
of
let's finish with that. John wanted to say something on the first one, and then we will finish with the question with a simple yes or no from each of us. So John, just on the first topic, and then we wrap up.
Well, I was going to add that an important part on the university side is if people have gone into industry, will they be hired back at a senior level inside of the university? Is the work that if they've done sufficiently significant intellectual research work outside, does it count? At Berkeley it does, at Stanford it does, and that's a very important part. And the issue of whether industry wants to hold those conversations is an important part of it. One major American company I was involved in did want to own everything for 10 years, and did want, I mean, more or less as Stewart suggesting, we sort of laughed at them, and they backed off, and the project went forward.
Okay. I first asked the panel to say yes or no, and then I will ask the audience to say yes or no on the question we have here. So Stewart, will it ever work? Yes or no?
Yes, it does.
Cameron?
Not if startups are trying to be created within the university, no.
Okay, no. John?
Well, the question isn't startups, it's startups and universities, so linked together, they can work.
So you as a yes. It would be a yes from my side as well. So the audience, after having heard all the deliberations of the panel, will it be a yes or a no? So who goes for yes?
Oxford style debate.
I think, and who goes for no? I think this is a clear answer from the audience. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody.